Types of pollination. Objective: to learn the types of pollination. Pollination is the process during which the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of flowers. Pollination is essential in the production of fruit and seed. To understand the process, let's first look at the reproductive parts of a flower. A flower is made up of 4 concentric whorls: the calyx, the corolla, the androecium, and the gynoecium. The calyx is the outermost whorl and is made up of leaf-like structures called sepals. The next floral whorl, the corolla, is made of the familiar colorful, delicate structures called petals. It's this layer that attracts insects, such as bees, for the purpose of pollination. The plant's male reproductive organ is the androecium, which is comprised of stamens. Each stamen is a thin, long filament on which the anthers are present. These anthers contain pollen. As they mature, they will split open and release pollen grains into the air. The gynoecium or pistil is the flower's female reproductive organ. This organ contains the swollen ovary at the base, a long tubular structure known as the style, and a sticky tip called the stigma. Now that we know the basic parts that are involved, let's look at the types of pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the same flower is known as self-pollination. The transfer of pollen from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another plant within the same species is known as cross-pollination. In flowers such as beans and tomato, pollination usually does not require pollinators or agents of pollination. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, requires pollinators such as a honey bee. When this little pollinator lands on a sunflower to gather nectar, its legs will be dusted with pollen grains. As the bee travels to another flower, it will leave behind some of the pollen when it stops, and this will be collected by the stigma. Eventually, the male pollen will unite with the female ovule during fertilization, and the ovule will become a seed. Besides insects, wind, water, and other animals such as bats also help in cross-pollination. Summary: pollination is the process during which pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of flowers. The transfer of pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the same flower is known as self-pollination. The transfer of pollen from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant within the same species is known as cross-pollination. Wind, water, insects, and animals are agents of pollination.
Hello friends, this is Vishal, and we are going to go through the reading and explanation second video of the lesson The Flower for the subject of biology, grade 6. As you know, in the first part of this video we studied about the flower, its parts, and the function of the flower. Today we are going to start with pollination. As you already know, pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. So there are two types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. So, as you can see in this diagram here, that the pollen grains from the anther of this flower will go to the stigma of the same flower. We can call it self-pollination, Even if the pollen grain from the anther of one flower goes to the stigma of another flower and both the flowers belong to the same plant, even then we call it as self-pollination. As you can see here, it's given. It occurs either within a single flower or between flowers of the same plant. Here the pollen grain from the anther falls on the stigma either of the same flower or of another flower on the same plant. Clear? So self-pollination means either the same flower is involved, or even if two flowers are involved, they both should belong to the same plant. The next one here is cross-pollination. It occurs in flowers on different plants. So here, when pollination is taking place between two flowers, both the flowers belong to different plants altogether. Then this is known as cross-pollination. This diagram here is there for reference. Don't worry, I will also be explaining this by a beautiful video that I have selected for you. And these videos that I have selected are purely for educational purpose only. So here we see, in this case, self-pollination. Here you can see that within the same flower the pollination is taking place, so they're calling it self-pollination. And in case of cross-pollination, we can see that pollination is taking place between two flowers of different plants. So when two different plants are involved, we call it as cross-pollination. When the same plant is involved, no other plant is involved, only the same plant is involved, or the same flower is involved, in both the cases we call it self-pollination. I hope it is clear. We go to the next part here, which is very exciting here, agents of pollination. Agents of pollination means these are the carriers of the pollen grains. So the pollen grain does not have any legs that it can run or walk, or even it does not have wings that it can fly off and reach the stigma. It needs certain carriers that will carry it from the anther to the pollen to the stigma. Right. Then first agent is insects. So butterflies, bees and other insects visit the flower for collecting nectar, with which they make honey. So nectar is that sweet liquid that is found in the flowers, and from that honey is prepared by the honeybees. When the insects visit a flower to collect nectar, the pollen grains stick to their mouth parts, wings and legs. When this insect visits another flower of the same kind, the pollen grains from this body may fall on the stigma and bring about fertilization. So transfer of pollen grains with the help of insects is known as insect pollination. This is found in mustard, it's found in marigold, in dahlia and salvia. These are some of the plants that preferably use, or it is seen in nature that insects help in the pollination of flowers. Okay. Now, because insects are involved, so the plant or the flower has to attract the insect, and to make itself attractive, you will find that the flowers are brightly colored, they are very large, they're fragrant, and they produce nectar. Nectar is the most important part here. Okay, then we move to the next one. The next agent is the wind, and in some plants like maize, palm and pine, they produce dry pollen in large quantity. When the flower matures, the pollen grains are blown away by the wind, and it happens to fall on the feathery or stigma of a flower of the same type. Now in this case, since the wind blows and the pollen is carried by the wind, a lot of pollens will be wasted. They'll fall here and there. So because it's not a very accurate method, so the plant has to produce pollen in a very large quantity. So a lot will be wasted, but some of them will be carried by the wind to the right place, and that is the stigma of another flower, so that then their fertilization can take place. Since the carrying of the pollen in these plants like maize, palm and pine is done by wind, we call it as, well, you've guessed it right, we definitely call it as wind pollination. The next agent that we have to study is water. Now, as you know, water flows. When water flows, it has the ability to carry things from one place to the other. So the kind of pollination where water acts as an agent to transfer the pollen is known as water pollination. For example, water pollination is found in Vallisneria. So this is a flower. It is an aquatic plant that is found in water, whose male flowers are submerged in water. They later get detached upon maturation and float on the surface of the water. When these floating male flowers happen to come in contact with the female flowers, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the female flower. So here, because the flower can float on water, and the male flower floats on the water and it's carried by the currents of the water, and in case it happens to be, as nature decides, that this male flower finds a female flower and it comes in contact while it is floating in water, and when that happens, the pollen grains are transferred and fertilization can take place there. Now, animals such as birds, hummingbirds, and we have seen even bats, even grazing animals also, they are used as agents by the plants, where the pollen grains get attached to the fur on the beak and the mouth parts, and from there when they move from one plant to the other, the pollen grains get transferred from one plant to the other plant, and they find a chance of falling on the stigma of another plant and getting useful for fertilization. Now, when we are using the word fertilization, let's have a look into fertilization as well here. Well, when we talk about fertilization, it's a very simple term to understand that fertilization is actually the union of male and female gamete. Whenever we are referring to the male and the female half cell or the gamete that is going to meet together to form the very first cell of the new organism, we are calling it fertilization. Definitely we studied under reproduction here. So after the pollen grains have landed on the surface of the stigma, they germinate to produce pollen tubes. One of the pollen tube continues to develop downwards into the style, and the pollen tube carries the male gametes. The pollen tube finally reaches the ovary, and further on reaching the ovule, the male gametes are released from the pollen tube and fuse with the female gamete, that is the egg cell, located inside the ovule to produce the very first complete cell known as the zygote. So as you see here, the pollen grains came on the surface of the stigma. So once they do that, they started growing a pollen tube. Now this middle one we can see has grown it completely, and the pollen tube grew and grew inside the style of the gynoecium, and it kept on growing, and it went down, and from down it went inside the ovary, and from inside the ovary then it was able to release the male the two male nuclei that were there. So it actually released it inside there, and when it released it, there the ovules were inside the ovary, and then the fertilization took place. A detailed video has been attached for your understanding. I'm sure you will be able to see that video as well. There may be a little too much in the video for you, my friends, but don't worry, you just grasp how much is required, and in case extra knowledge is there for you, well, that's always good and always welcome. So don't worry in case you find something extra in the videos. In case you are not comfortable with the extra stuff, no problem, just go through with understanding the concept that is there in the book. So as I mentioned here, the revision says the fusion of male and female sex cells, that is gametes, is known as fertilization. The ovary after fertilization becomes larger, develops into a fruit. The ovule containing the fertilized cells develop into seeds. So we came to know that this structure helps in the development of a fruit, and inside structure the ovule will develop into seeds. So we will, in the next video, we will have a look into the fruits and the seeds part of the syllabus here. I hope it is clear. Today we have studied about pollination, types of pollination, agents of pollination and fertilization. And do enjoy the videos. Thank you so much for enjoying this complete video. God bless you. Keep in touch with your studies. Be safe. Be smart. Thank you very much.
Pollination. Pollination is commonly defined as the process of pollen transfer from anther to stigma of a flower. Pollen grains are formed in the pollen sacs, which are completely enclosed by multi-layered anther ball. Therefore, the first obvious requisite for pollination is the opening of anther sac to release the pollen grains, anther dehiscence. Depending on the source of pollen, pollination can be divided into two types. 1. Self-pollination, autogamy. 2. Cross-pollination, allogamy. Self-pollination, autogamy. Transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower is called as self-pollination. Cross-pollination, allogamy. Cross-pollination is further classified depending on whether the pollination has occurred between two flowers of the same part, geitonogamy, or between two flowers of different plants, xenogamy. From a geneticist's point of view, geitonogamy is similar to self-pollination because all the flowers of a plant are normally genetically identical. Cross-pollination makes sense only when two different plants, either of the same species or different species, are involved in this process. Pollination ecologists plead that since geitonogamy and xenogamy both require similar ecological fathers for pollen transference, they should be considered under one category. Self-pollination is possible only if those plants which bear bisexual flowers that achieve anther dehiscence and receptivity of stigma simultaneously. The majority of angiosperms bear chasmogamous flowers, which mean the flowers expose their mature anthers and stigma to the pollinating agents. This may be brought by opening the flower, or the organs may protrude from a closed flower in such a manner as to expose themselves to the same agents. Another group of plants have seeds. They do not expose the sex organs. Such flowers are called cleistogamous, and the phenomenon is termed as kleistogamy, which may be inherent or ecological, induced by severe environmental conditions. Commonalia bengalensis bears two types of flowers. A. Aerial flowers, which are brightly colored, blue or violet, chasmogamous, and insect pollinated. B. Underground flowers, which are dull and cleistogamous flowers borne on the subterranean plants of the rhizome. Under certain environmental conditions, the plants which commonly form chasmogamous flowers start providing cleistogamous flowers.
Inside the ovary, it consists of ovules, and each ovule has an egg cell which is a female gamete. The pollen that is produced by pollen grain transfers from stamen to stigma. It moves through the style and reaches the ovary. The male germ cell or male gamete produced by pollen grain fuses with the female gamete that is present in the ovule. This is called as fertilization.
Double fertilization. S.G. Navashin, 1898, was the first to show that both the sperms released by a pollen tube are involved in fertilization. They fertilize two different components of the embryo sac. The phenomenon is unique to angiosperms and is called double fertilization. The nucleus of one of the sperms fuses with the egg nucleus, thus completing syngamy. This results in the formation of a diploid cell, the zygote. The other male gamete moves towards the two polar nuclei located in the central cell and fuses with them to produce triploid endosperm nucleus. As this involves the fusion of three haploid nuclei, it is termed as triple fusion. Since two types of fusion, syngamy and triple fusion, takes place in an embryo sac, the phenomenon is termed double fertilization, an event unique to flowering plants. The central cell after triple fusion becomes the primary endosperm cell, PEC, develops into endosperm, while the zygote develops into an embryo.